Nation in Conversation is proudly brought to you by AFGRI, NJ, Grain SA, John Deere, Monsanto, Nedbank and Senves.
Good day and welcome to Nation in Conversation from Nampo Harvest Day. I am Mmatlou Kalaba. Remember to follow us on Twitter at Nation Converse. The Nation in Conversation app is available in the App Store. For more information, please visit our website, nationinconversation.co.za. It has been labeled that the next great track, that is Africa. South African farmers are leaving the country in droves to seek greener pastures further north of our continent. Why do these farmers really leave South Africa, and what are the opportunities waiting for them in Africa? On the panel today, I am joined by the following guests. Dr. Theo Jager, President of Pan-African Farmers Organization, as well as the Southern African Confederation of African Unions. Mr. Jacob de Villiers, Managing Director of Grain Management and AFGRI. We have Mr. Bonani Nyhodo, Trade Research Manager at the National Agricultural Marketing Council. And finally, we have Mr. Theo Vorster, the CEO of Galileo Capital. Gentlemen, welcome. Starting with you, Theo Vorster, at the end. Take us up from the question that we asked. Why are South African farmers leaving our shores to participate in farming on the continent? Do you have any idea?
Yeah, thanks, Mmatlou. I think any business has a few basic principles, and one of those principles is a risk and return calculation. So anybody that allocates capital, look at the risk of that capital and the return that they can earn. Now, the fact that there's policy uncertainty in South Africa will influence that decision. The fact that there might be other countries that are offering incentives to farmers might influence that decision. The fact that there's great opportunities in the sense of weather, in the sense of quality of soil, in the sense of government that want food production, that want farmers, all have an impact on that risk-return principle. And it's not only agriculture. If you look at the rest of South Africa, if you look at South African businesses, listed entities, property development companies, our retailers, Checker Shoprite has been spearheading Africa expansion for years. Some of our big retailers are building retail stores in the rest of Africa. So this is not only an agricultural situation. It's all about risk return within a portfolio. And I think we need to rather say that if the owners or farmers or entrepreneurs see opportunities, they are also developing in South Africa. I mean, so the South African agricultural entity, we are not net importers of food. We produce food and we are a very competitive environment. So it's to do with risk and return, and I don't see it as leaving South Africa. I think it's more to do with looking at opportunities where the risk-return ratio at this point is better. You might find big farming entities, big agricultural companies that will invest heavily in South Africa because the risk-return profile is on their side. But I think it's all about capital, is all about risk, return and diversification of a portfolio.
So you say these factors are multifaceted. They are from politics to macroeconomy, risk, and the farm issues. But let me take that forward to you, Bonani. From where you are seated, from NAMC and as a trade manager, what are additional issues to those that Theo has just mentioned?
When we look at the movement of farm operations, one of those, I'm sure if we look at them product by product, is that farmers are business people. And the decision they take at times, we may think that they are a group of disgruntled or unhappy people, but it's a group of entrepreneurs who in some products would have seen an opportunity that if you produce it outside the borders of South Africa, where those countries have preferential access to lucrative markets, then it makes lots of business sense for one to move outside the borders and produce. And the case in point, one of those would be sugar. So it's not only unhappy people, some of them are very happy fellows.
Okay, so you are also adding that opportunities play a role in this movement. But now, Jacob, just from AFGRI's point of view, you are present in some of the African countries. What has been some of the issues, the drivers, the happiness, the opportunities that drove you there?
Mmatlou, I think both Bonani and Theo touched on it. Firstly, we follow the farmers into Africa wherever they go because there will be opportunities going forward. But from our side, we acknowledge that we operate in a pretty saturated agricultural sector, and the opportunities for growth is not necessarily in South Africa. We continue to service our client base in South Africa, but we need to find new customers in the rest of Africa to serve in order for us to grow.
Okay. And Theo, you are the president of the Pan-African Farmers Organization, the president of the Southern African Confederation of Association or Union. So you are dealing with these farmers, I imagine, at some level, be South African farmers or farmers in those countries. So what is the level of these opportunities? Is it the same for both farmers, or there are certain opportunities that South African farmers can actually take better than the local farmers?
The farmers in Southern Africa and East Africa, and more so also in North Africa, Arabic Africa, are business people, so they are driven by profits. Farmers will go where they can make a good profit. And hence, all these other issues which underlies investment comes into play. You'll find a wonderful interaction between South African, but also Namibian and Zimbabwean commercial farmers and local farmers in other African countries. There are now Zimbabwean and South African farmers in 42 of the 54 African countries. Especially the relationship which you will find in countries like Zambia, Mozambique, and Tanzania between commercial farmers, newcomers, and local smallholders, which brings about modernization and mechanization and commercialization.
Okay. And just on that point, Theo, I think something that one must be careful not to miss is that, and I see that even in other industries, is that South Africa is a country, but the rest of Africa is not a country. We talk about South Africa and the rest of Africa. The rest of Africa is a multitude of countries, different legal frameworks, even different languages, different customs, different rules pertaining to agriculture. And I think one must just be careful to talk about Africa as if it is a country. South Africa is also in Africa, but they are 50-odd countries in the rest of Africa. And everyone has their own peculiar environment.
So, and I think that point is very relevant to what I want to put to you, Jacob, just briefly. Have you observed that diversity in countries that you're operating in? Maybe you should just start by explaining quickly what are some of those countries that AFGRI is participating.
Well, AFGRI grain management is in Uganda, Republic of the Congo, Zambia, Zimbabwe, Mozambique, Tanzania. From those countries, and Mauritius, apart from the language difficulties, because it's Portuguese, French, and English-speaking countries, just to get a company registered might take you a year or more in almost each one of those countries. So it's definitely a huge stumbling block, just the bureaucracy to become involved there. But there are lucrative opportunities in each one of those countries from an agri perspective.
So you're saying, going back to the issue of risks that you have to take in order to go over some of those challenges in terms of business registration. And quickly, Theo, and are there some of the key opportunities that you think are obvious in this profit-making business?
Oh yes, oh yes. You know, Africa sits with about 46% of the world's underutilized land, even more of its underutilized or untapped groundwater sources. We have, on average, the best climate of all the continents. So the growth point for agriculture is on this continent. Now, I will never say that South African commercial farmers understand Africa. I think we know we don't understand it. But we understand it a hell of a lot better than the Chinese or the Brazilians or the Russians or any of the other aggressive agri-investors in Africa.
Okay. But for now, it sounds like we're talking about Africa or countries in Africa as if they were just discovered in the last 20 years. We're talking about all these opportunities and utilized land, yet these have been around for a period of time. Why now, or why in the last period of years? But before we get into that, I think we should take a break and then we'll discuss that point, particularly why Africa now, what are specific opportunities that are ahead for those who are going there. This is Nation in Conversation. We'll be back right after the break. Welcome back to Nation in Conversation. Just before the break, we were just discussing these opportunities in Africa. And I was saying, why are we now so profoundly concerned about these opportunities in the last 20 years, but Africa has been around for a very long time? Bonani, what has given a rise to this sudden focus into Africa?
In my view, what has happened in the past is that South Africans were focusing on South Africa because at the time there was no democracy. So immediately we got into a democratic dispensation and there were a number of policy changes. Then the whole focus changed from South Africa, then we looked further. And the kind of relations that South Africa had with other African nations, then it changed. So what we have now is a South Africa that is more part of the continent than it was before.
Okay. And
I
yes,
think
Theo.
that I fully agree with what was said. My view is that I think there's a few more factors. I think South Africa first became an open society. We became a democracy, which allowed us. We have to now travel to Africa with passports, which I think changed the whole perspective. We were officially in Africa as tourists or as business people or as investors. But also I think there was a change in Africa, and I think that change came about that there was a post-colonial era that we are now in an environment where we're getting more towards democracies that's governed by law. And a democracy that's governed by law is at least a basis to do business with. So a few things happen. And then I just think the world simply realized that as the world population grows, we need to supply food to the world population. And because of the growth in the world population and the urbanization of the world population and the need for food, it creates an opportunity. And from a business perspective, this starts to make sense. And I think we also need to be careful to say South African farmers. It is individual businessmen that invest in individual countries based on a need that they identify and on an opportunity that they identify. But my point is that just be very careful. South Africa is a constitutional democracy. Yes, we've got turbulent decisions. Yes, we are arguing about what the interest rates will be if our investment grade were to change. All of that you put to one side if you start to invest in the rest of Africa. Most of those countries do not have this advanced legal system. Most of those countries have even more difficult processes from an administration point of view. And I think that comes back to the risk-return basis. It is each and every one of these countries has a different environment with different opportunities.
So you're saying that you still have to go through a number of hoops in order to actually eventually access those opportunities. But earlier on, Theo, you also mentioned a point about the opportunities in Africa being viewed from the global perspective. That means those opportunities are therefore not only for African farmers and South African farmers. So you have competition from elsewhere.
Let me answer that question. I was talking to one of the big South African property development companies who's developing a property in Eastern Europe. The property is in Eastern Europe and he's developed big shopping complexes in Africa. He said, why is he not competing in Eastern Europe against Americans or Western Europeans or Germans or what? He said, simply because I understand how to work in a developing country. And that's where South African farmers, they understand how to work in a developing country. The same benefit that he would have because he has shopping centers in East Africa, in West Africa, that he had to go through to develop them, that same skills he uses in Eastern Europe. And that's where the South African farmer has a benefit. They understand it is a process, it takes a lot of relationships, it takes hard work in order to get things done.
Okay, so that is understanding the market where you're operating. And AFGRI is currently operating there. What lessons, what other understandings that Theo is talking about were really necessary for your operations and are assisting you to continue operating on the continent?
Well, I think that the first one, and I think that's something that anyone that wants to venture into another African country needs to understand, is you must be part of that country. The responsibility of each African government is to look after its people, and you must support the government in looking after the people. I think a lot of the African governments see agriculture as one of the future growth opportunities and for one of the things that can get their people out of poverty. So we need to understand that the African governments want to invest in agriculture and that we need, as South Africans in Africa, need to understand our place and our position and how we can enhance the government's role in that.
Oh, okay. And Theo, now just slightly shifting to the opposite side of the coin. Opportunities comes with threats and risk management skills are required. What are the foremost threats or issues that one needs to overcome while operating on the African continent? And some of the countries, obviously, Theo would say Africa is not a country.
Although Africa is coming of age, and although democracy and stability is ever improving all over the continent, in all 5 of its regions, stability is always an issue. There is not one of the countries, except maybe for Botswana, Namibia, where a farmer would not have that under the first 5 considerations on his list of risks. That's why we find that many South African farmers who are investing elsewhere would not invest in one country. You'll find the same family in Mozambique and in Zambia and in Congo, because they believe that something might go wrong in Africa, but it will not go wrong all over the place at the same time. You have the spread of risk.
So that's diversification.
One of the biggest challenges is access to financing, because there are very few countries in Africa where you have private ownership. Land is not good collateral in Africa. If I would approach Jacob today in Uganda and say, I want to borrow money, he will take my South African farm as collateral for that. Until today, I tell you, property rights, ownership of land in South Africa is anchoring the expansion of commercial agriculture in Africa by South African farmers.
So there are lessons to learn from what is going on here and elsewhere.
Oh yes, and some countries learn those lessons faster and better than others. That's why we say Zambia is probably one of the best investment destinations for farmers. They are really aggressively trying to improve ownership issues in Zambia.
Oh, okay. And speaking of the improvement in Zambia and other countries, I want us to quickly look into now what has been in it for the host countries. Are there benefits? Are there some capacity buildings? Are there other issues that the countries gain from welcoming our enthusiastic farmers and risk takers? You are one of those, Jacob.
Well, I think from a farming perspective, the knowledge that the farmers take into Africa is you can't buy that with money. A lot of the universities in African countries focus purely on the theoretical side of people, rather than investing in what they can learn on farm. And I think that's invaluable for any African country. But apart from that, the investment that a company such as AFGRI or anyone else take into a country, job opportunities and developing rural area is invaluable.
Oh, okay. And just to pass a quick one to you, Bonani, again in line with the opportunities that are due to the host countries. We have seen countries such as Zambia and Malawi, who in the past were net food importers, suddenly becoming net exporters. Can you also link that to what our farmers are doing, the pass through, the knowledge gained from having experienced large commercial farmers?
One of the things that is not said often is that the movement of South African retailers into the continent of Africa has to some degree assisted in this. Because if you have a ShopRite in Luanda, one of the issues they would put forward is that in your procurement of food or any of these agriculture products, procure a certain amount from our farmers. And that to some degree has led to programs that government would have to get willing farmers out of South Africa into their countries so that they can work around incubating a couple of farmers. So the fact that if you go to a mall in Potchefstroom and go to a mall in Lusaka, it looks more or less the same with the exception of the language you would hear, is that to some degree the other businesses who are not necessarily agriculture have assisted in the movement of farmers.
So you're saying there is some form of integration at agribusiness and general business level. So we look at those issues around integration when we come back from the break. This is Nation in Conversation. We'll be back right after the break. Welcome back to Nation in Conversation. Before we went to the break, Bonani, you were talking about the retailers and other agribusinesses from South Africa that are in the rest of the continent. And you, Theo Vorster, you did indicate that it is actually businesses that are moving over, not necessarily governments. However, over the last period of time, or you can go back to 1963 with the formation of the African organization, which is today known as the AU, that they had this idea that Africa needs to be integrated, be united, and move together. So we have signed a number of deals. Southern African Development Community, we have Southern African Customs Union, we also have the latest, the tripartite free trade agreement between 26 countries on the continent, right? So to what extent are these agreements facilitating the movement of both goods and people? Or is it a normal business as it goes, or the governments are really doing enough to encourage business participation?
Look, I think, Mmatlou, there's two sides to that question, or two sides to the answer. The first one is you have to harmonize, you have to make it easier to do business. That means from movement of people, movement of goods. That's the regulatory side where governments can play a big role, and quite frankly, I do think they're moving in that direction, but I clearly don't think it's as far as it should be in terms of free movement of goods and people and easy to do business. That's the one side. But next to that is the practical infrastructure, the infrastructure to do business. If you move goods from one country in Europe to another country in Europe, it's a very easy process. If you move capital from one area to another area, it's a simple process. Just as if you were to move it from one side of America to the rest of America, it's an easy process. In Africa, that process is, so apart from the regulatory framework, just the infrastructure in terms of roads, in terms of freight, in terms of rail, and moving it through the different bureaucracies. That is still very difficult, costly, and time-consuming. So one hand is the government, the other side is the practical infrastructure on the ground of moving stuff. And then what you do find, and that is not something you want, is regulatory uncertainty, or almost a miscommunication in terms of certain of the regulatory process. And it seems sometimes that the decisions or the agreements to filter that down and to make that standard procedure and to get it through the whole system, that sometimes is not as efficient as it should be. And that type of thing, businesses work around that, but that will give you immediate dividends, those kind of structures, if you can implement it. And I think that we've come a long way, but I do think there's still a tremendous amount of work that can be done that will create immediate dividends for everybody concerned.
And Jacob, he mentioned the movement of goods from point A to point B. You are in the grain movement business. How do you overcome some of these infrastructural deficiencies that are talked about on the continent?
It's a challenge to move goods within a specific country. It's a bigger challenge to move it cross-border. There's no real answer how to overcome it. The answer is you need to understand the rules and you play by those rules. And if you need to take 3 weeks to move something from Zambia to Zimbabwe, then you know that and you do business according to those rules.
Okay. And Bonani, so from the governments, what are the bottlenecks towards moving some of the barriers with regards, say, transportation? Infrastructure is quite wide, but just let's talk about transportation, which is basic, is something that you would want to start with if you really want to encourage movement of goods between countries. What are the key barriers towards creating such opportunities on the basis of infrastructure?
Yes. You know, in the talks of the tripartite FTA, you would have heard that there was this dream that we need to have a railway line that moves from Cairo to Cape Town. And the question is, if you have that, it moves across a number of countries. And what we haven't even harmonized at this point in time is even the size of the railway line itself. So you can move, you can put a train on the line, it moves until it gets to Botswana. When you get into Botswana, the specifications of the line may change, which would mean you may not get a train to move from South Africa to Cairo on the same line. Then there was this talk of the big road. And the last time I checked, the only place where the road was not linking was in Tanzania. Whether it's completed or not, I'm not sure. But if you look at this issue now, you take an example of moving apples from the port of Cape Town to the port in Luanda. It takes few days. But for it to be cleared in Luanda, it takes over 10 days. And if you start to understand some of the things that happen there, it's very scary. So some of the things, it's not about the infrastructure, it's about the way we do business. And if you take an example, so you move it on average 4 or 5 days on the sea. You get it on a truck, you drive, it takes you about 10 days. But as you cross these borders in going to Angola, there would be fees that you would have to pay in each of these borders. And by the time you get into Luanda, the cost of what you have in the back of the truck may be exceeded by the cost you would have incurred in getting the product to that country.
So, but gentlemen, as you heard me earlier on, I indicated that some of these agreements were signed 60 years ago. SADC was signed more than 20 years ago, so that's recently. But you're telling me that the basics have not been done in 60 years. They've not been done in agreements that were signed last year. An unfair question is, so why do we get into this space, Theo? Why do we sign this while the basic things are still hanging?
We do have wonderful infrastructure on this continent, organizational infrastructure. Okay. The regional economic commissions, COMESA, ACTISA, SADC, but they are not very functional. You have in every country your bureaucrats, and then you have these super bureaucrats on a multinational level. And that's where things are not being done. At the recent ACTISA board meeting in Lusaka, the complaint was that in this part of Africa, our intra-regional trade in agricultural produce is less than 3%. And the question was, shouldn't we just utilize our own markets better? Until one farmer said, well, you try to take a container with perishable goods from Cape Town just to Brazzaville. See through how many informal toll gates and roadblocks you need to go, how many days you need to sit at the border post, and then you understand why intra-Africa trade is so little. It is a governance issue more than an infrastructural issue. And before we do not rectify the governance issue, the infrastructural issue will not be sorted out.
So you're saying it's not enforceable in the current situation?
No. Some of our countries, now I'm going to name it, a country like Congo DR is simply too big to be governed the way it should and too rich to be left alone. Hence, you run into all these informal barriers.
Well, that's a very interesting point. And I can, okay, let me...
I just want to ask Theo a question there. He made a statement earlier that for me was quite interesting. He said that South African farmers invest in Africa on the back of the security of their farms in South Africa. But then if that is, and I take that point, that is the case. If we take that assumption, what is the relationship then with the South African farmer and the local community where they farm? Because clearly there's an ownership issue, there needs to be a relationship issue. How does that work in the bigger scheme of things?
Theo, before you respond, maybe we should have this going into the next session because it's very interesting and we cannot just leave it to a few seconds. And we'll come back to that. This is Nation in Conversation. We'll be back right after the break. Welcome back to Nation in Conversation. Before we went to the break, Theo Vorster just posted a question to Theo Jager, so I'm going to paraphrase it. Is the grass greener on the other side of the fence? That was Theo's question, that you have uncertainties, you have regulations that are making you wonder whether you'll make it in here. Then you move from South Africa to a country like the DRC with massive resources, water, soils, you mentioned them. But then you have a different set of challenges. So how do they deal with that when they eventually face the reality on the other side of the fence? I think that was Theo's question.
Without hesitation, I would say the grass is not greener on the other side. If you cannot make it in South Africa, you will not make it elsewhere in Africa. Those who are successful in South Africa who can risk diversifying into Africa. And we see very few South African farmers who are really leaving South Africa and establish themselves elsewhere. There are those too. Sorry, the vast majority, they would diversify into Africa, but keeping a home base here. Theo's question on using South African land as collateral to access financing and what the implication is with risk sharing with local smallholders as partners, brings three other players also into the field: development aid agencies, and only between American and European development aid agencies, they have spent over the last 2 decades more than $1 trillion on agricultural development. And there's very little to show for that money. So you'll find that they would rather prefer these days to put their money into partnerships between commercial farmers and smallholders. But so also governments, such as the government of Ethiopia, the government of Zambia, who have chosen to take the public-private partnership route to developing their smallholders in partnership with well-established commercial farmers. But even off-takers. When Bungi was still in a partnership with Senves, they were very fond of approaching commercial farmers to say, if you would carry part of the share, we would carry no more than the normal part of the risk when you engage smallholders, because they wanted to show that they are also involved in the developmental side of agriculture.
So it is that part about risk sharing, having partners and working together with everyone who's part of the sector.
Yeah, and also, it's one thing to say that I will take somebody who has never been exposed to commercial agriculture or commercial value chains and train him, mentor him to be a commercial farmer, see how long it will take you, against the model where I'm a fruit farmer, so we often graft a different variety of tree into an existing rootstock. This is the model that has shown itself, or proven itself, to work better in Africa. Take the existing rootstock of smallholder farmers and then craft commercialization and modernization onto that by engaging them in partnerships with commercial farmers.
I think you're already talking about the next topic that I want us to move into quickly, that is the future. Where are we going? So up to so far, we talked about the potential, the opportunities, but that is historically up to where we are. But I want us now to look forward, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. I mean, Africa is one of the continents that still has majority of people under the age of 25. It is the only continent that has the highest growth rates in terms of population. And you can talk about the growth rates at the GDPs of various countries. So there are signs that the move is in the right direction when you break it down into some of the countries. But from where you are, from your operation or from where you work, where are we going? How is Africa going to look like? And what are the new opportunities that are likely to emerge from this future Africa? Let me start with you, Bonani, for time being.
Where are we going? My first point would be at a certain point in time, Africa's population would be more in urban areas than in rural areas. And it would mean the whole ball game would have changed. Now, what one would have to do is to say, as these fellow Africans are migrating from rural areas into urban spaces, what happens in the areas where they used to live? Would those lands be available? Then the other issue, you know, when we talk about available arable land on the continent, the question is that as we get farmers to farm that land commercially, we know the story of the continent is that the use of inputs is very low. Hence, you get lots of yields that are very, very, very low against the effort that fellow Africans put working their land. And in some areas, it's like Madagascar, or you go in Tanzania, where you see people still using hand hoe. So those things would change, which would mean in the business of machinery, I'm sure that's an opportunity. In the business of the chemicals, that's an opportunity. There's lots of opportunities. And I would want to agree with Theo. I still believe that the grass is greener here.
And Jacob, let me give you an opportunity to tell us about the grass.
Well, I think I need to agree with Bonani. I think what we need to understand, it's not going to be easy the next 10 or 20 years. But we as Africa have a huge responsibility to feed the world in 2050, and we need to come to the party. I think it's important for us to find a sustainable model where we can unlock the potential of smallholder farmers on the continent, and to ensure that by unlocking that potential, we can feed the world after Africa has eaten.
So you see smallholders in future feeding the world, smallholder from Africa. With the right model,
it was good to add from Africa, but if my statistics is correct, the majority of food actually comes from smaller farmers at this stage, maybe from India and Eastern Europe. But we need to find the right model, and it's not the farming itself that's the issue. It's the access to markets, it's the logistics, it's the access to funding. We know all the challenges. We need to face those challenges, and we need to find a solution. And we probably only have 20 years. And if we don't do it as South Africans in Africa, other continents will come here and take our produce for their own use.
And Theo, how optimistic are you about unlocking these opportunities to move to this beautiful future Africa?
I think there's a point of departure. If you're not successful in South Africa, you're not going to be successful in the rest of Africa. You need to, South Africa is, your home base needs to be successful, and Africa needs to be where you expand to, number one. Number two, I do think an issue that people neglect is the value of connectivity. People these days know what's going on in the rest of the world. They know what can work and what cannot work. And communication, movement of information, movement of money, that's almost, country borders is irrelevant. So people will get better informed as things go on, better informed on what works, what doesn't work, all of that. But, and I think that's where that we need to understand. With any big change and any change in the way things develop, it is not linear, number one. Number two, it usually takes longer, but the impact is a lot bigger in the end. And that's the same with technological adaptation. It takes longer than everybody thinks, but in the end, the impact is a lot bigger. I also do think that as Africans realize, or the rest of Africa realize, what the dividends can be of getting their act together, you will start to see that the pace coming through because information is available.
And finally, you, let me say, from your position as the president of the Two Continental Farmers Union, are they as hopeful? Are they seeing a better future as Theo painted it for us?
You know, my generation of farmers, is probably what the Moseses We will look out over the promised land, but it's not we who will enter. But we are a planting generation, not a harvesting generation. But if we don't plant, there will be nothing to harvest. I recently ran into a pastoralist in Kenya. It's an old man. He calls himself a poor peasant, but he has 3,000 head of cattle. When I walked through them, I noticed that at least 60% of these cattle are male. And I asked him why. He said they are stronger. They can pull the sleigh with the firewood and so. I said to him, but you should restructure here. How many did you sell last year? He said nothing, also not the year before. He used 2 for a funeral and 4 for a wedding. I said to him, if you have this in a commercial cycle, you can be a millionaire. He said to me, I'm not in that business. And as I drove off, his 2 sons came running with their smartphones. They wanted my email address because they said, when the old man is gone, we want you to come again. Watch this space.
On that very interesting note, join the conversation. Download the app Nation in Conversation from app stores. Follow us on Twitter at Nation Converse. More information is available on our website, nationinconversation.co.za. You have been watching Nation in Conversation from me, Mmatlou Kalaba. Goodbye.
The world is changing today. The world is changing in every way. Let's stand together, put our hands together, join hands forever. We're making it better. No matter where you are, you could be near or far away. We're